afternoon, fellow residents. My name is Larry Randall. I'm the chair of the Land Conservation Committee here.
Yeah, here we go.
Check, check. Better?
Yeah.
All right. So, not to repeat myself, I'm Larry Randall, the chair of the Land Conservation Committee, and thank you for joining us for yet another in an ongoing series of lectures that we have arranged since the summer of 2021. So we have to try to keep up the streak. In any case, before we go any further, you know that we have to go through the usual craziness with the what's the first thing you do when the alarm sounds? Right, and then you what? Cover your ears or remove your hearing aids. Okay, and then should it be necessary to depart the premises, either of the two double doors, and those first to leave would be all those who can what? Ambulate without assistance, right? And then the rest of you will be assisted. It's always puzzled me as exactly why, but in any case, so that's the policy, and I'm only just telling you what the policy is. Okay. Today we have the rare pleasure of having three presenters, all of whom have either a direct or indirect connection to Woodland Pond. Our presenter-in-chief, Nell Boucher, is the archivist for the past dozen years at the Mohonk Mountain House. And by the way, she was preceded by another resident who I'm not sure is here today. No, Joan LaChance preceded Nell in that position. And Nell's father, sitting in the front row over there, is also a resident, Urban Boucher. Then, seated at the table up front, we have two residents, Pril Smiley and Paul Huth. Pril has been a member of the Smiley family since her conception. And has served on the board of Smiley Brothers Incorporated, which operates the hotel. She's been on that board for half a century. And as she says, she's actually worked in some capacity for all of her 80 years. But in any case, and Paul Huth, as many of you know, is the now emeritus director of research for the Mohonk Reserve, but has served, and he still seems to be unable to resist the call of the mountain, and so he goes up very frequently. But when he was actively employed, he was there for roughly 40 years, working with Dan Smiley. So anyway, that's the introductions, and I won't prolong this process, so I am going to turn this over to Nell, who will start things off.
All right, thank you, Larry.
Is this lighting
Hello.
normal?
I don't know, is this lighting normal?
You have no light on you. Light. It has to be on. Just
Well,
If you want to
I
see the
would like
screen,
you to be
you
able
have
to
to have
see
two
the
lights off,
screen.
except for those in the outfield. So, the choice. You can see now, or you can see the screen.
So, I wanted to start off by saying that I'm thankful to the Bard of Mohonk, who knows secrets that the Ridge can only tell, and that's Paul Huth.
Thank you.
Yes, I think Paul, if you know Paul, you know that Paul knows the Ridge more deeply than any other human alive. And it's very nice to have you here. And I also need to thank Pril Smiley, because without her, I would not be standing here. And I appreciate Larry Randall, who shared his observations, thereby helping me to better understand the larger context of the historic details that I work with every day at the Mohonk Mountain House Archives. Each of these people has over 50 years of experience on and advocacy for the Ridge. So together they represent over 150 years of cumulative personal experience. Larry Randall said to me, "When you look out the windows at Woodland Pond, you see the Ridge. The Ridge in its essentially natural state is the dominant element of our viewshed and sets the tone for the entire area." The tradition of land conservation on that ridge reaches back over 150 years in history to Albert Smiley in 1869. In the 1870s, the only way to preserve land was to purchase it, so that's what he did. Albert said, "I've created this property, the result of 76 purchases. As a landscape artist does his canvas, only my canvas covers 7 square miles." Over the next 90 years, the Smiley family, over the next 90 years of Smiley family proprietorship, land preservation was maintained in that way. And then in the 1960s, the foundation was laid for the formation of the Mohonk Preserve, which protects the land today, while at the same time making it accessible to thousands of wilderness tourists in the spirit of Albert Smiley's first endeavor. When Albert Smiley first considered purchasing the Mohonk property, it was the landscape around Mohonk Lake that captivated him, not John Stokes Tavern. It was impossible not to be in awe of so many spectacular natural features concentrated in one place: a mountain lake, dramatic rock formations, primeval forest, and views of mountains and valleys in every direction.
Among our earliest images of Mohonk Lake is this 1865 photograph showing how the landscape looked about 4 years before Alfred and Albert Smiley made their first visits to Mohonk Lake, and later Albert's purchase of 280 acres of that land in November. And I say, notice the few trees on the summit of Skytop on the shoulder here. And this is taken down lake, looking up the lake. The mountain house now sits right over Pine Bluff. And all the trees are missing there because of extensive cutting for tan bark harvest and for lumber and for hot, dry time forest fires, which damaged and killed most of the summit trees that you see right there. So as Nell was saying, the view shed was really sweeping in every direction. Next. Guests on their way to Mohonk, arriving to New Paltz Village by stage, trolley, or train, had to cross the Wallkill River to follow an approach route to Mohonk, much the same as we do today. This rare image, one of a few that exist anymore, was taken of the covered bridge over the river at New Paltz between 1870 and 1891, when it was replaced by a single-lane steel bridge. This is a rare Mohonk commissioned aerial photograph of the east slope of the ridge and the Mohonk Foothills Farms, showing the landscape through which guests were transported to the Mohonk Mountain House, passing through the impressive testimonial gateway arch right there, and then along the Oak Alley, which we walked on a couple of trips with Grace. The Oak Alley really, as you all remember, frames the grandeur of the fields and forests to come. The hairpin curves of the carriage roads were allowing guests different views over a short distance. They were designed to take advantage of the lay of the land, and they provided, most importantly, a compatible road grade for the teams of horses going up and down the mountain. And if you were coming from New Paltz like we do to go toward the ridge, you'd be coming in here through the Testimonial Gateway Arch, the Grand Arch, follow the Oak Alley down and around the bend to Brook Farm. Coming up from Brook Farm, you'd go through the woods here and up into the Duck Pond watershed, where at Duck Pond there was a watering trough to rest and water the horses. And then you'd come up on top of the Kleinekill field, and that field right there, the road goes right along the edge of the slope. And I always say that's our Woodland Pond view shed field, because being up there today on that top field, you can still get the grand view that Guest did 100 and more years ago. Then travel through the woods up to the base of the Skytop Cliffs, and then imposing cliffs all along, slowly along the way, until you make the big turn at the end of Skytop Cliffs. And for those of you who really know the land well, and you're coming out here toward the gateway, of course, Route 299, the state highway, comes right through the woods right there. So that woods is now divided by the state highway. Driving up the east slope by carriage, guests experienced firsthand the extensive agricultural clearing you see all here. Farmers using every inch of their land, their fields reliably producing a steady crop of stones each year, harvested at great effort and used on rough stone walls bounding their fields. You can see here going up right to almost the base of the steepness and the big rock talus slope below the Trapp's Cliff. As guests came near their destination on the summit of the mountain, their carriages followed a route through open land, rounding the great Skytop Cliff with stunning close-up views coming right around the base of the cliff, followed by a spectacular lakeside approach to the Mohonk Mountain House. Today, this skytop view from the south is totally screened by mature forest. As a guest at Mohonk, and you're wanting to schedule a carriage drive along the top of the ridge, a Mohonk carriage would transport you along winding summit carriage roads with wide views of valley, forest, and cliff formations. Crossing this wooden bridge, as seen in this 1927 photograph, over the old Wawarsing and New Paltz Turnpike, the same as Route 44 or 55 today. This overridge crossing through the natural gap in the cliffs. Remember, the cliffs are solid, and then there's the gap through which Route 4455 travels. That break in the cliff was used by indigenous peoples 10,000 years ago on an Indian path, Native American path crossing the ridge, and of course by the European settlers crossing over 300 years ago. And we know that there's an Indian rock shelter about 500 feet downslope from this bridge. From the Mohonk Mountain House, guests looking out on the other side of the ridge, the west side, toward the northward and westward view, saw a bottomland of landscape almost fully cut and used for agricultural use. The only woods clinging like these patches to the steepest slope. And if we look at the view today, if you go out on North Lookout near Mohonk, just northeast of the mountain house, and you look right there, you have the old Clove Chapel, and right here is Mohonk's Chapel Farm. And you notice the one thing that we did on the other side of the ridge, notice the rocks were growing well on that side too, full of stone walls. Okay, thanks, Nell.
This is just the, a 1905 overview of the Mohunk Mountain House, just so you get a picture of what it was like in the middle of the ridge. Of course, not visible from this side, but somewhat visible actually on the back side of the ridge, looking from the Catskills or the west. You can see the higher roofs of the mountain house. But at least just to briefly note, you can see that how open it is. There's very little grown in here. This stone summer house, which was built in 1890, is still there. Garden Road, where you enter now, swings a little bit further out, but it's much the same. The gardens are more complex. This was then the show garden. These were mostly actually berry fields that were berry patches. Guests could go pick berries. So much is actually the same. I mean, the whole sweep of the mountain house, all the building sections that were changed, some from wood into stone sections, they're all in place. And this is still the dorms and still the powerhouse, which then in this view was only 5 years old. So this was just a quick overview, but you can see how grown in things get in 120 years.
So here we are back looking at the ridge. After the initial 280-acre land purchase, the Smiley brothers realized that going forward, they needed to extend their land holdings as much as possible to prevent encroachment from development. They first acquired parcels in the Traps and the Montague areas, and in the early 1900s concentrated on adding farmlands to the resort holdings. As many of the nearby farms became abandoned because of the lure of city life or the richer farmlands of the Midwest, the Smiley family eventually pieced together a mosaic of over 100 farms. A group of Mohawk farms provided the mountain house with fresh milk, some fresh vegetables, and meat. Refuse from the hotel kitchen was fed to the pigs. The pig farm produced pork for the tables. Animal fats salvaged from the kitchen were used to manufacture yellow soap, which in turn was used in the kitchen and laundry. The operation of the farms by 1930 saw nearly 40 men employed, working with 20 horses and 2 tractors. Nearly 1,000 acres of Mohawk land were cultivated or in pasture. Through the first half of the 1900s, the Smileys continued to purchase land to further protect the overall estate and to enable expanded construction of the vast road and trail network that was a direct benefit to the Mohawk guests and visitors. During the first 50 years of proprietorship, the Smileys had developed an impressive network of carriage roads, winding through thousands of acres of scenic ridgetop and forest lands that surround the mountain house. These carriage roads, Pril, did you want to?
Keep going.
They were built with labor-intensive methods, using picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, crowbars, sledgehammers, stone boats, horses, hand-cranked derrick, and a portable steam engine. No power tools there.
That's a close-up of the steam engine.
Yep, that's the steam engine there. See the chimney?
And I think we think this is the barrels holding the water that it provides for the steam. And the workers, these are their steam drills, drilling down, in vertical with dynamite into where the rods made holes so they could insert the dynamite.
So this picture is 1924. And here we have 1900 steep terrain necessitated using hand tools to further break apart the large chunks of conglomerate that were blasted from the rock walls. So the carriage road system that we at Mohawk Mountain House and the Mohawk Preserve use today, it was made in this way, without power tools.
And if you want a real technological challenge, try making this road down Laurel Ledge, where I'm sure the challenge was, how can you make a level surface for the workers to get in there with the tools when you haven't built the road for the workers to get in there with their tools? Needless to say, a challenge and probably somewhat dangerous work, but the walls that have been built up to hold these roads they're a masterpiece of construction because they're still holding up after 100+ years.
They are masterpieces of construction, and some of the first ones that were built were Eagle Cliff Road and Woodland Drive. So if you've come up to Mohonk Mountain House and gone for a walk, you see the traps in the distance. You probably have walked on Eagle Cliff Road. And Woodland Drive was completed in 1872. So this is early. This is early on. When they finished, the total number of miles was 110 miles of carriage roads.
This is my favorite map of our carriage road system on top of the ridge. Written, you can't see the fine print. It's Lake Mohonk Drives, not called roads, drives, where you drive the carriages, respectfully dedicated to Mr. A.K. Smiley and his guests by one of them. So one of the guests, he must have had some kind of surveyor's chops, did this wonderful map. And I think the thing that's most notable about it to me is the road circling all around. There's not a straight line in sight. So this is not anatomically correct, but I think the person doing this layout of the carriage road system, what he captured is in fact what the layout of the road network was, which is every bit as artistic as it was a master of engineering. And so the road network was, like for instance, going from the hotel, you go up here to where there's the lily pond and up here, and then you're going to go over to Skytop, and the road around Skytop, it goes around so that around every curve, first you see the Wallkill Valley, and then the road curves this way, and you see the Rondout Valley, and all the roads were designed that way. Same with Eagle Cliff here, it has one exposure of a view, and then another exposure of a view, and this was because of the really strong feeling and really the artistry of Daniel Smiley, first generation Daniel, where he wanted the guests to be experiencing the landscape. I keep going back to that word because it's not just having them be able to look at scenery and the way today's people, not all of them, but some of them, it's more hikers going out and I call it sort of the snapshot culture. You go along a road and you're looking for the next place for a great snapshot. These carriage riders or hikers, walkers didn't have cameras with them by and large, and so they really were experiencing going around the whole top of the ridge. And this is, Nell mentioned that the first roads were like up to Eagle Cliff and then around Woodland Drive, and then gradually the roads just continued to stretch out across the whole ridge. Paul wanted to mention how it feels. Paul's walked more miles over more years than anyone else alive.
About that. I think a few of the audience here might have beat me on that. But one of the things that Dan, I had a 15-year time with Dan Smiley, of course, the naturalist and third generation family member, and we went all over the ridge together. And one of the things that I always thought about was that you train your apprentice by showing he or she the nuts and bolts of the operation. But what Dan was doing with me was showing me personal, much depth, more depth and personality of the process. Little did I know he was grooming me to take his place. But on Undercliff Road, as I said to Pril and Nell the other day, you travel on Undercliff Road below the Big Traps Cliff, or through it actually, through the talus. and you're coming along, valley view on the one side, nice wooded, gentle slope on the other. You come around the big hairpin turn, and bam, there's a 250-foot tall cliff right in front of you. And then you come around the double hairpin, and you parallel that base of that cliff all the way out to the tracks. So very thoughtful, artistic layout, not only just artistic, but I know Daniel in some of his writings was very concerned about going up Skytop, of course, the big double and sometimes triple hairpins going up for the good of the horses and the teams.
I'm gonna talk.
Isn't this a beautiful aerial shot? And we're looking at Eagle Cliff on the left and Woodland Drive right in the foreground here,
Yep.
Skytop Tower.
Yeah, this, just continuing a little bit from the Carriage Road network, as the Carriage Road network expanded up and down the ridge, it really was part of the reputation of Mohonk and used heavily to promote Mohonk, that there was public access facilitated, first of all, actually by the extension of the Wallkill Valley Railroad, and then the Mountain House being enlarged. And by the way, just because there was so much of this, the entire top of the ridge being wooded, that the forest allowed the founders and those after to draw wood from the forest for furniture, bridges, fences, and heating. Many hundreds of cords of wood every winter to be able to heat when we finally had heat.
So then by mid-century, the property encompassed 7,500 acres. However, the business began having difficulty supporting such a large estate. The Mountain House did not produce sufficient income to take care of the entire tract, and yet the Smiley family remained united in its opposition to the idea of the land becoming fodder for developers. The answer, after much discussion with trusted friends, financial advisors, and attorneys, lay in forming a private, not-for-profit corporation called the Mohonk Trust, later called the Mohonk Preserve. Brothers Dan and Keith Smiley spearheaded this endeavor. In 1963, the preserve was established. There was excitement in formulating its objectives and testing new concepts of land stewardship that embraced education, scientific study, inspiration, and recreation. A stated mission was the improvement and understanding of man's relationship to man and man's relationship to nature, thus formally enshrining the original philosophy of founder Albert Smiley from the early days of the preserve's founding. Dan's activity gravitated to the scientific and educational work, and his brother Keith to Mohonk's human networking, tradition, and world peace. An immediate objective of the preserve was to acquire and serve as the steward of certain very special acres. Mohonk lands not essential to the operation of the resort. Dan Smiley likened this to the Native American concept of communal land ownership, and he declared that as a result, it became a turning point in the history of Shawangunk land ownership. He surmised that for the first time since the days of the Native Americans, women took an active part in matters to do with the land. The founding gift that established the preserve was made by Dan and Keith's mother, Mabel, all the way on the left there. Other founding trustees included Rachel Orcutt Smiley, Virginia Smiley, and Ruth Smiley. So Virginia is Pril's stepmother, and Ruth is Sandra's mother.
Daniel Smiley stepped down from the hotel operations in 1971, and the management transitions of the 1980s further compelled him to devote the major part of his time to scientific research. From the early days of the Mohonk Preserve's founding in 1963, Dan's activities gravitated to its scientific and educational work. He assumed the mantle of the first administrator for the preserve and its first director of research, thus finding a new context for his diverse nature studies and for the work of his increasing number of research associates. One of these, Paul Huth, oh, that's me, sorry. Later became Dan's personal research assistant. The over 90 square miles of the largely undeveloped Shawangunk Ridge was the base for Dan's scientific investigations, the wellspring for his long-term documentary observations, resulting in hundreds of summary research reports and the inspiration for his aesthetic and historical research. By the 1970s, the preserved lands had grown to over 6,000 acres, and it had become the largest privately owned and funded nature preserve in New York State, as it still happens to be today at over 8,000 acres. With the preserve's growth, Dan became concerned about the long-term management of the unique ridge ecosystem and for the continuity of his ongoing research projects, especially his baseline long-term studies. This impelled Dan to create his own quasi-independent research organization as a hedge against the preserve possibly shifting its priorities and as a spur to the preserve toward moving in the directions he believed essential. At the core of Dan's long-range plan was establishing a dedicated research facility to safely house, archive, and protect over a century of unparalleled research, collections, and natural history observations. He personally financed the construction of a 2-story addition to his longtime residence on Mohonk property and named it the Daniel Smiley Research Center. And this is the Elms Cottage, Dan's home. Moved in there about 1945 or so. And this is the research center, the 2-story research center that Dan added in 1980 at his own expense. And I remember moving materials in from the house. We got things, Pril, I think, from under the beds and in the closets and down the cellar and in the attic, and got moved into the archives. And when the concrete was poured on the floor of the lower level of the research center, the night when it was poured, a raccoon walked across the concrete. And when we got done and Dan painted the floor, he always painted little squares unpainted around the raccoon footprints. And they're still there yet today. And I think, Pril, that's your bedroom right up there, is that
Yes,
right?
it is.
Oh, okay.
Had to share it with my sister, but
Well, you have to do things like that.
yes.
Upon Dan's death in 1989, after working so closely with Dan for 15 years and learning to see the world the way he did, I was asked to carry on Dan's legacy as the preserve's second director of research, thus ensuring the continuation of his work as he has hoped, which I carried that capacity on for about 22 following years. Here in this image, I'm standing with Dan down in Mossy Brook, looking at the annual growth of a hemlock twig, not knowing that 5 years in the future, an invasive insect would show up and decimate our hemlock stands all over the mountain. The Daniel Smiley Research Center is now the literal and philosophical home of the Smiley family legacy of scientific study of the Shawangunk Ridge. The preserve adds every year to now internationally significant phenological records, or the study of events, plant bloom, bird arrivals, that began with Dan over a century ago with the help of Brother Keith, and continues the first generation Smiley's weather records, which grew exponentially under Dan's guidance for over 50 years and now spans 127 consecutive years. For those quick on math, that's about 46,300 consecutive days of weather observation, now as part of the National Weather Service. And it offers a unique record in understanding the effects of a changing climate on our local and global systems.
And as all those tracts of land were sold off to the preserve, this represented to outsiders an astounding decision by the family. Selling land at a price significantly less than what Albert Smiley had paid in purchasing the original acreage decades before. Ultimately, the 5,300 acres sold to the preserve enabled the formation of a span of untouched wilderness along the Shawangunk Ridge from Gardner to Rosendale. As Dan Smiley summarized, the mere acquisition of land at Mohonk has never been an end in itself. From the early days, there's been a blending of concern for preserving the beauty of the landscape and the integrity of the flora and fauna with appropriate human use and enjoyment. There has been a feel for land as a living organism, the sustainer of all life. In 1986, Dan Smiley, along with several family members and staff members, decided to apply to the United States Department of the Interior to have Mohonk declared a National Historic Landmark. There was widespread enthusiasm throughout the organization. However, there was noted challenge of applying. The designation, let me see. The purpose of the designation is to recognize individual historic buildings, sites, structures, objects, and districts, not large land holdings. But Dan felt strongly that Mohonk's contribution to the cultural and historic fabric of the United States was unique, that many of Mohonk's supporting buildings deserved recognition, along with the Mountain House itself and the entire 7,500 acres of land. They were important. All of these elements were important. Hence, the application listed not only the Mountain House, but 83 buildings, summer houses, those are those little rustic gazebos, for those of you not familiar with the term summer house that we use at Mohonk. There we go. So these are some of the images that show how diverse those structures are. It's the stone summer house, constructed in 1890 of native stone and Rosendale cement, and costing a total of $193.86 to construct, including labor.
And horse labor.
And horse labor, yes. And the clay tennis courts, constructed in 1910 using clay-like soil called hardpan that was dug by hand with pick and shovel from the nearby athletic field. And here are a couple of more of those historic structures. The fountain, constructed in 1902 at guest request as a commemoration to the garden wing building. The fountain was created as a commemoration to a building that was so beloved that when it was torn down, the guests lamented its absence. It stood there from 1875 to 1902. This fountain, which you can still see today, features a centerpiece of quartz crystal clusters surrounded by lily pads and goldfish. And then on the right, I think this is one of Pril's favorites. This is why we put it in here. This is the dynamite storage shed. Constructed, did you want to talk about the dynamite storage shed?
Well, it's only a couple sentences. Constructed around 1900 and tucked under the cliff so that storing the dynamite, if there was an accidental explosion, the percussion of the explosion would not damage the mountain house. Where it's located now is kind of at the side, may not be standing now, but where it's located now, if it were there and if it exploded, it would kill about 200 guest cars in the parking lot. But not the mountain house.
That's right. So the landmark status was attained in 1986, and then in 2011, Smiley Brothers Inc. decided to divest itself of another tract of outlying land on the east side of the ridge. This may sound familiar to those of you paying attention to the news in recent years. 857 acres consisted of historic Brook, Pine, and Kleinkill farms, along with the Testimonial Gateway.
Brook Farm, Pine Farm, Kleinkill Farm up above.
Thank you, Paul. As with the land transferred in the 1960s, this acreage was no longer integrated with Mountain House operations. Current management energies needed to be concentrated on the core operation. The board of directors strongly favored a plan to assure that this iconic foothills farmland remained free from development. Fortuitously, the Open Space Institute stepped in to acquire the property, providing the perfect partner to come into Mohawk's land use vision. The concept was for OSI to act as an intermediary and purchase the Smiley Brothers acreage, with the stated intent of continuing traditional farming operations, protecting the property, and ultimately transferring the land to the Mohawk Preserve. Upon this purchase, OSI presented the Smiley family and the Mohawk Mountain House with the OSI Land Conservation Award, recognizing the Smileys as having pioneered land conservation in New York State. In coming to the decision to get rid of this large piece of land, the Smiley family and the board of directors recognized an opportunity such as this was unlikely to ever come up again. The most important considerations were not only practical and financial, but philosophical, based on the Smileys' long-held stewardship ethic. During board discussions, Bert Smiley observed that while the family is unapologetically emotional in their attachment to the Mohawk lands, there is unanimous agreement that ultimately stewardship is more important than private ownership.
And I want to chip in here saying that, and Sandra and I were both sitting in this, Sandra Smiley, my dear cousin, here in the front row, we were both sitting in a board meeting where we went from unapologetically emotional to a unanimous agreement that stewardship is more important than private ownership, because what we struggled through in a board meeting and did end up with unanimous consent was that of course, first, second, and including the third generation of Smileys, especially Jerome Smiley, were really, really attached to the farmlands, because the farmlands had been inextricably connected with the business in the early first 90 years. And even when Sandra and I were growing up on the mountain in the late 40s and 50s, we still had a milk farm at Clonakil, and even our own pasteurizing plant in New York State made us do that. We were still growing hay for horses, straw for summer houses, and so we were still feeling like the farmlands were supporting us. But by the 1970s, the farmlands really, it was the opposite, unfortunately. The land taxes and the maintenance of the farmlands, they just were kind of a luxury. So it was very difficult for the family and the boards, both of them, to just arrive at the ultimate decision that we had to turn over these lands to OSI and ultimately the Mohawk Preserve.
So this is the Testimonial Gateway. This is actually an architectural rendering by the architect James Ware, who designed it. It was built in 1907. And now it's a trailhead for the Mohawk Preserve.
And I want to add just something about that James Ware, he did this as a watercolor rendering of what he was about to build. And by the way, his architectural drawings are exquisite. He had also designed the stone parts of the Mountain House and the porte cocheres and the parlor wing. But he was, I felt, like expressing the same kind of feeling that the original Daniel Smiley did in laying out the roads, that when guests would approach through this testimonial gateway, in this rendering, he's giving the feeling of the approach. You're not just arriving at Mohunk for a vacation, but especially in a watercolor medium, the way just the land and its pastels are kind of laid out, it's really enticing you into an experience and not just a vacation.
And so this entrance to the Mohonk Estate, the beginning of your journey, or the beginning of the last leg of your journey as a guest to Mohonk, it frames the landscape. Like Pril said, it's the gateway to Mohonk. And Jerome Smiley emphasized at that time, he was the last third generation Smiley family member in the room when they were deciding to divest this land. And he emphasized that he supported the land transfer because the view of the archway would now have an even more poignant and far-reaching meaning, as it would provide a gateway to the Smiley's vision of the land.
Today, looking at it from the preserve's point of view, while we have some 10 formal trailheads and informal access points around the ridge, with the Preserve Visitor Center, of course, and the traps, this relatively new eastern trailhead at the Testimonial Gateway, again, you can see right there. It brings us back to the original concept, as Giroux stated, as a gateway to the Smiley's vision of the land.
I think to add to that, it's just occurred to me while we were putting this together that the relatively recent River to Ridge Trail is really doing the same thing, and fortunately because of its donor, was able to put both a lot of money but also a lot of artistic sensibility in designing the River to Ridge Trail, which after all starts right by the Wallkill River Bridge that guests originally came across, going across and around very artistically around the cornfields, up on the ridge where there's the little international airport, and then eventually comes, across, it zigzags the trail, through, over the fields, and eventually up toward the duck pond, but still affording the same kinds of views that guests had when they were approaching Mohonk. And so that's really inviting community into approaching the land and not, don't even have to pay a preserve visitor's fee.
So planning for this talk, Larry Randall reflected that the Smiley family's worldview was critical to the way the landscape of the ridge has evolved. They achieved and still maintain a unique balance of respect for the land with commercial success. I asked Larry if he thinks that the local community is aware of the landscape, how the character of the towns surrounding Mohonk and their industries was impacted by the plan laid out by Albert Smiley between 1870 and 1910. And he replied that whether or not they understand it, I think they respect and appreciate the way it has played out over time. Hudson River school painters like Sanford Robinson Gifford traveled to upstate New York in the 19th century, when industrial development's effect on the landscape had already replaced much of the natural landscape with factories, cities, trains, and farms. If there's one thing I hope you remember from today, it's that founder Albert Smiley and 5 generations of his descendants set an example of hard work and determination to preserve the natural landscape. This was grounded in their devotion to the spiritual power of nature and its meaning in the American narrative, including nature's ability to balance the ravages of modern life. So whether you take a walk in the hills or look at the landscape through the window, now you'll know that you're reaping the rewards of Albert Smiley's vision sown over 150 years ago. Thanks.
thank you. I honestly didn't expect to be quoted so much as you did, but I will reflect very quickly that Marla and I have been coming to the guns since 1967, so like others here, we have a 50-plus year of experience climbing, hiking, picking blueberries, skiing, taking our 3-month-old daughter up the lemon squeezer on Sky Top, and so on and so forth. So I'm as much, maybe not as much, but I'm well invested in the land here as well. So I'm gratified to see we have a full house, and I want to give you an opportunity. It's now 10:03. We have a few minutes. Are there any questions you would like to ask? Yes, Lucy.
I grew up in Cragsmore, so I know what it's like to be here from my childhood.
Right.
Any other questions? This is a one-time only opportunity.
When was Skytop built? I see in the different images, it's sometimes in the photos or in the paintings and sometimes not. I'm not quite sure when it was built. Does anybody know?
Nell does.
The Skytop Tower that stands now is the 4th tower built on that site. The current tower was built between 1920 and 1923. It took a while to quarry the stone from, actually, when you go up and see Skytop Reservoir, that's the quarry hole. And they turned it into a reservoir that powers the fire suppression system in the Mountain House. But it was finished in 1923. There were earlier towers that were made of,
I noticed that in the artist's rendition of the Gateway Arch, that there was something up there at that point, 1905, I think.
Right, and so that was a wooden tower. So the three wooden towers, 2 of them blew down and 1 burned down. And then there are pictures between 1909 and 1920 when there isn't a tower at all, because they're between
That
towers.
explains.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Any other questions? Okay, well, if not, I want to, yes.
I was curious about the interaction between Mohonk and Minnewaska. I know that's state run now, but like Larry, we skied and hiked those trails, and there was points where trails would come together. But it didn't seem to be a friendly relationship there, but at any rate, I don't know what the background is.
I would say it was definitely a friendly relationship. The 2 resorts were founded by twin brothers, and they had a cooperative relationship in the 1870s and on through the 1950s, 60s. I'm not even sure if it ever ended. That if you were staying at one, you could use the facilities at the other. There were actually, for decades, daily carriages that went back and forth between the 2 properties. And then the story of how Minnewaska became a state park is one that's too long to tell today.
Yeah. Another election.
But I don't know if either of you would like to add anything to that.
Next lecture.
Next lecture, yes. Yeah, another question.
Well, how did they get the money originally, the family, to buy all this property?
That's a great question. And again, it's a really interesting story. So Albert Smiley didn't have a lot of money. He was not a Gilded Age guy. He was a Quaker schoolmaster who was working at the largest boarding school in the Northeast, the Friends School in Providence, Rhode Island. And he and his wife were pretty frugal, and they had saved about $14,000, and it cost $28,000 now, which sounds like a great deal, right? If somebody wanted to sell you Mohonk Lake for $28,000, you jump on it, except that in 1869, that's actually a lot of money. But long story short, he took out a loan. And that's why he didn't stay at Mohonk for the first 10 years he was there. He kept working, running the Providence School so he could pay the mortgage. And as time went on and he got more and more guests, he did take out more loans. But that's kind of the way to build a business.
The other, Wanawaska, there was a Smiley.
Right, Minnewaska has a very similar story. Yes. Yeah.
We'll come back.
Thank you.
Yeah, as many of you probably know, there were 2 hotels built at Lake Minnewaska. One is called Cliff House and the other is called Wildmere. And they both burned down in the 1970s. I'm not sure if there were any suspicious circumstances attached to that, but the then current owner, who was not a Smiley, was having financial difficulties. And of course, there's a very long story, as has already been said, as to how that property ended up being the state park that it is today. So,
Through valiant efforts of local people.
yes, not least of whom just said so, Barbara Rubin.
Yes.
If ever you feel that you're helpless and you can't do something, you can.
Yes.
I might just add too, though, that with the Minnewaska State Park Preserve today is over 20,000 acres of assembled property, one of the largest state parks in the state. And it's a park preserve, it's not managed, it's managed more for the preserve part of it for land and species than access and people. And so one of the real things that's important is how do you manage a 100 square mile tract on a high mountain ridge with cliff faces and trails. And we have about 500,000 people visiting the ridge every year to all of the different entities. How do we manage that and protect the ridge from ourselves going there all the time? And so we formed in 1994 with the Preserve and the Nature Conservancy, we formed the Shawangunk Ridge Biodiversity Partnership, which has 11 members. And the way we designed it was that we wanted to manage the ridge with no boundaries. If you're managing landscape for species, for ecosystems, you can't say, well, here's my boundary and over there we do something different. It all has to be managed as one entity. And it's still in place today. We don't meet as much as we did. We're meeting like crazy when we started out in '94 in the Preserve and Nature Conservancy. But all of DEC, Office of Parks in the state, Cragsmore Association, Mohonk Mountain House, all of them have been involved in some way or other in looking at the lands that they are influential in managing. And so we've done our best for the ridge. I think when we look at it, when we're looking at fire management, we're looking at rare species, bird arrivals, peregrine falcon nesting, climbing on all the different cliff faces. How do we manage climbing? So all of that is done as a group. And I think that's what makes the strength of the system for, I think really in part for what the National Park Service has done and designated the land in association with the original ownership of Mohonk. As Dan said, it's a unique situation in the nation today. And I think we all as managers and active staff today, we all recognize that designation.
The reference to the vast numbers of people who come here and recreate every year reminds me of my favorite quote from Pogo: "We have met the enemy and he is us."
Is there a group that is dedicated to climate change? And is there a group dedicated to the climate change that is happening all in the United States and around the world?
I'm not aware of any one group. I mean, there are many organizations, small and large, governmental and non, and who are, to one degree or another, concerned about climate change.
Even the Sustainability Committee right here.
That's correct. I said large groups and small. So
It
and,
starts small.
But yes, well, as with the effort to preserve what became Minnewaska State Park, that started small, and here we are 20,000 acres later. But in any case, there is no simple answer, I'm afraid. It would be nice if there was some godlike figure that would just come down and say, this is the way it shall be done, folks. But as you all know, it don't hardly work that way.
I might just add quickly before we end that our weather records are 127 years long, and what Dan Smiley did and I did with him and afterward, we were really, the old climate scientist said to me 50 years ago, he said, Paul, you know when the climate is really changing. It's not your numbers only and trend lines, but what are the species doing on the ground? And we have Dan's records of plant bloom and bird arrival dates going back just about, as Pril said, about 100 years. And so we can look at the trend lines. We're about almost 3 degrees above where the average temperature was in 1896 from our weather records at Mohawk. And we know that bird arrivals such as phoebe, towhee, thrushes, hermit thrush, wood thrush, they're about 3 weeks earlier than when Dan started recording in the 1930s. And our plant bloom of our earliest bloomers in the spring are ephemerals, bloodroot, hepatica, all of those types of flowers. They're about 10 days to 15 days earlier than when Dan started recording. So we're continuing, as I said in the talk, that we're continuing, Preserve is very actively recording and continuing those long-term databases to feed in to all of the work done by the national, regional, state, and local agencies for looking at the impacts of climate change. Is it happening? Yes, it is. From our data, it's very clear things are changing, and as the old climate scientist said, if the species are changing, then it's not only your numerical data and your trend lines, but you know that things are changing. Look at the rocking of the climate from dry to extremely wet. No snow. We're 22nd snowy, snowless winter this year. I just got the weather, the 122nd year weather summary. We're the 22nd snowless winter in our 127-year history. The lake froze over, Mohawk Lake froze over. We had a nice window of about a week of ice cover, which was about 6 days earlier than average. And then we warmed up and it all came back off again. And so one of the things that one of the scientists in SUNY New Paltz said to me recently, because we have records of ice cover on lake, ice on and ice off for about 75 years. And he said to me from the university, he said, Paul, he said, in 50 years from all of your weather and lake temperature data that you and Dan have taken for so many years, in 50 years, Mohawk Lake will not have any ice on. So that's the severity and the local impact of things. But we're feeding information constantly to local, regional, and federal agencies. If you go online to the National Climate Data Center of the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NCDC, National Climate Data Center, and you put in Mohawk Lake, you can get all over 122, I guess, years of original data sheets. So if you put in March of 1939, and you click, up will come our weather sheet from 1939.
Great.
Okay, well, thanks again.